come in. Right, your life.
Okay, thank you. Well, first I want to thank Caitlin and Molly of the Antique Boat Museum for inviting me today to speak. And in reference to that, I'd like to present a copy of my book to the museum.
Thank you.
So I may step out of camera range to pass this off. I will use that opportunity to say that after the talk, I'm going to be selling copies of my book. I have 2 books here. To those folks that are getting in, viewing from the internet, you can visit my website, douglasbrooksboatbuilding.com, and you can purchase books there. If you can't remember that name, just Google traditional Japanese boat building, and I'll be the first 50 hits. So tonight's talk is really, I'll just do a bit to introduce myself. I'm a boat builder, writer, researcher, and teacher. I live in Vermont, and I have apprenticed with 9 boat builders from throughout Japan. I am the sole apprentice for 7 of my 9 teachers, and all of my teachers were in their 70s and 80s when I worked with them. So this talk will go through most of those apprenticeships. Just in the interest of time, I really need to drop a few of them. But I'd like to hopefully give you an overview of Japanese boat building, talk a little bit about apprentice learning and what that's like, and then, of course, throw it open to questions from you folks. And there'll also be apparently a chat function for people tuning in online, and so we may read questions from there. So my apprenticeships span the country. This map shows all my apprenticeships as well as some major boat building projects I've done in Japan. My first apprenticeship was here out on Sado Island, the Sea of Japan. I first went to Japan at the invitation of my college roommate, who was from Hiroshima. And I traveled out to Sado Island on that first trip in 1990 because I had a magazine photo, a page from a Japanese magazine that showed a woman in a barrel out to sea gathering shellfish. And I did not think such a thing could really exist, but this is actually the first photograph I took my first morning on Sado Island. And this is a place that is famous for what's called a taraigune, which means tub boat. And indeed, these are used for fishing, and primarily and traditionally used by women. When these were invented, as ancient seeming as they may look, they were actually their only first recorded use in the fishing industry is in the late 1800s. And as I learned later, in the late 1800s, a tremendous earthquake raised the sea bottom 5 or 6 meters. And you'll notice this volcanic shelf. So this entirely new seascape was created. And that was too difficult an environment for traditional fishing boats to operate. The rocky coast was very sharp and just too crowded to navigate, but it was a perfect environment for seaweed and shellfish. And so somebody invented this barrel boat, and it changed the dynamics of the fishing economy in that region because suddenly a fishing family put the second adult to work. So the women came out of the kitchen or the rice fields or the vegetable gardens and went out and supplemented their husband's own fishing. So she has got a bamboo spear with a metal tip on it, depending on what she's gathering. In this case, she's gathering wakame or seaweed, and this wooden box has a glass bottom. So she paddles over and then reaches down and gathers either shellfish or seaweed. And this kind of fishing is found throughout Japan, mostly done by wading into the water with a sight box or goggles. And there's actually a separate verb in Japanese for what isonegi, which means inshore harvesting, as opposed to net fishing and line fishing. The Japanese actually talk about harvesting from the ocean bottom. In one village, the men, for some reason it's men only, that use these boats in this village, they put outboard motors on tugboats. And You notice he's using the paddle off the bow of the boat. And these boats are paddled from the front. But again, a view of that rocky volcanic coastline, which provided the environment for these boats to work. And these are still used today. My teacher at the time I met him was one of only 2 craftspeople left building tugboats on Sado Island. By the time I came back for my second visit in 1992, he was the last professional builder of these boats. And he had never had an apprentice. And through a series of visits, finally on my 3rd visit, he invited me to be his apprentice. And I took this photograph in 1996 when I was working with him as his apprentice. He surprised me at the outset and said that there would be absolutely no speaking in the workshop. And so indeed, we walked in the first day, he pointed to a stool, told me to sit in it and watch him, and he worked. And he worked for 2.5 days. And here he is, he's planing, sitting on the floor, like traditional Japanese carpentry. He's holding the workpiece, which is a stave of the tugboat, between his feet, and he is planing the curvature. And in this moment, checking that curvature with a pattern. And he did this for 2.5 days, then got up, pointed to this spot on the floor, and looked at me and said, "Work." And he walked out of the shop. And I expected him to come back and supervise me. I expected him to be having a cigarette. But in fact, he didn't return till the end of the day. And later, my wife told me she found him sleeping. And when he came back at the end of the day, he took the pile of staves that I had planed and he segregated them into 2 piles. One pile he called good, and the other pile he called bad. And he pointed to the bad pile and said, "Fix them, then clean the shop." And he walked out again. And so you notice a few things, no direct instruction, and also no instruction as to what made a bad stave and what made a good stave. And so I was forced in that moment to figure out what I had done wrong, did my best to correct it, did as I was told, and corrected them, or so I thought, and then cleaned up the shop. But this is, I'm getting early in my talk, this is the basic ethics of Japanese apprentice learning. The apprentice learns solely through observation. There is no direct back and forth with the teacher. So this turns a lot of what we are used to in education on its head. And I'll talk more about that in light of other apprenticeships. The sides of the boat temporarily put together. The sides are doweled with little bamboo nails and held with a temporary bamboo hoop. And my teacher is smoothing the inside edges, getting ready to put the bottom together. By far, the most difficult part of building these boats are the braided bamboo hoops that hold them together. And in Japan, all traditional barrel work and bucket work, they are held together with braided bamboo hoops. So we went behind his house, we cut down several stalks of timber bamboo. They were about 50 to 60 feet tall. And we split them 4 ways with his homemade splitter, then split each of these again using his hatchet, or a draw knife, I should say more accurately, and then shaped the strips. And finally braided them into hoops. These have to be sized perfectly. There's absolutely no way to adjust the size of this. So there's a special measurement system. And in my apprenticeship, sadly, though I managed to braid one of the 3 hoops for our boat, I really didn't understand how it was done. But luckily, I had the presence of mind. I bought my first video camera before this trip, and my wife videotaped him working. And later, back in America, I sat in front of my television set and my VCR. The audience is old enough to remember what those are. And I had plastic strapping, like you see big boxes wrapped with. And I probably played and rewound that videotape 100 times, but I got it. I figured out how to braid the hoops. And in a way, I replicated the classic Japanese apprenticeship because I was only with all my teachers for the time it took us to build one boat, one or two boats. But the classic apprenticeship in boat building was 6 years. But the apprentice might spend the first 2 years, full 2 years of that, doing nothing but sweeping the shop, except they were also watching their teacher. And so we might say, oh, just sweeping the shop, but in fact, the apprentice is expected to be learning through that whole process. And then may be brought into sharpening and then expected to work and do the job perfectly. So it's truly a trial by baptism by fire. This is probably the rarest skill I possess. Barrel makers are even rarer than boat builders today in Japan. And I would say there's no more than 24 craftspeople nationwide that know how to do this. So this is my teacher with the bamboo hoops prior to putting them on the boat. Sadly, my teacher passed away after my apprenticeship with him. A foundation on the island reached out to me and said, "You were his only apprentice. We now have a crisis. There's nobody who can build these boats. What can we do?" And so what I suggested was we do the traditional thing, and I would train a Japanese carpenter. This is a house carpenter from Sado Island, and he and I built 2 tugboats together under my training. And then I said, and then we will do the non-traditional thing, and you will publish my research. So this is my first book, The Tugboats of Sado Island, The Japanese Craftsman's Methods. It's in English and Japanese, and it is nothing more than a how-to build tugboats. And was actually pretty revolutionary because when it was published in Japan, because really this kind of thing didn't exist in Japan. There were no how-to manuals because even to this day in Japanese culture, it's expected if you want to learn some traditional skill, you must find a master. It's still in many people's minds, it must be a direct transmission. So the very first published drawings of a tugboat, these are my drawings, and these are in shaku, the traditional Japanese measurement system, which is what my teacher used. And so in all my drawings, all my research, all my publications, I use the same measuring system. Japanese boat builders do not use the metric system, which is otherwise universal in Japan. The shaku, by the way, is a very convenient measuring system for all of us to understand because one shaku is 11 15/16 inches. So it is that much short of a foot. But it's a decimal-based system. It is not divided into 12ths like the Western English or inch. So it's divided into tenths, which has its own advantages, actually, working in tenths. So yes, first drawings of a tugboat. This is exactly how my teacher laid out the bottom, the arcs and the radius of the arcs he used. So I remain faithful to, when I record my teachers, I remain absolutely faithful to their methods. And here, from left to right, is the steps in braiding the bamboo hoop. So we can expand that repertoire of people, potentially, that know how to do this. There is now a professional builder of tugboats on Sado Island. It was not my apprentice. He did not continue building boats, but I have spoken to, I haven't met him, but I've spoken to him on the phone, and he told me he learned entirely from my book. So, small victory in my work. So moving on, after sometimes I like to think I went to Japan to become a boat builder and I became a barrel maker. I was eager to build a, quote, real boat. And my second apprenticeship was just east of Tokyo, the community of Urayasu, which is famous now because it's the home of Tokyo Disneyland. And Tokyo Disneyland sits on landfill that was once some of the richest fishing grounds in Japan. This photograph, this is downtown Urayasu. You are looking at some of what at the time this photo was taken, 1,700 registered fishing boats in that town, all wood. This is 10 kilometers from downtown Tokyo. And this picture was taken in
92.
oh,
19.
1892. This picture was taken in 1964. And in the 70s, a series of chemical spills destroyed those fishing grounds. And they were completely unfit, for human consumption. And so developers bought the rights to the bottom of the bay and filled it in. And the current shoreline of Urayasu is over 2 miles out from the original shoreline. And that's where Tokyo Disneyland sits, all on landfill. And so this whole culture was destroyed overnight, literally overnight. My teacher told me the boats were piled up and burned because there was no place for them to go. There was no further market for them. And the fishermen, of course, were all put out of business. This is my teacher. He was invited in the early 2000s to build one of the iconic boats from this community, a little seaweed gathering boat inside the brand new Urayasu Folk History Museum, which, by the way, if you go to Tokyo, is an excellent, excellent museum. There's a number of old boats on display, and it's a really great record of the former history as a fishing town. And I had met him. I met him on previous visits, and he told, quite to everybody's surprise, including mine, he told the museum directors that he would not build a boat unless he taught the American. And so I got a phone call and rushed over to Tokyo and apprenticed with him. So there he and I working side by side. This is his drawing. Some Japanese boat builders, perhaps a minority overall, use drawings. If you're a boat builder, you might notice that you can't build a boat from this because this drawing's incomplete. You see the profile of the boat, bow, stern, transom, actually shows the expanded transom, which is rare. And then below the center line here is the bottom of the boat, the plan view or the aerial view of the bottom of the boat. But what you don't have is the plan view of the boat here at the chine or the sheer, the deck edge. So you don't know how wide this boat is, essentially. And I've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of these drawings, always done on a plank of wood. And when you ask a boat builder, well, why is the drawing incomplete? The answer is, those are my secrets. And where's the missing information? It's in my head. And so secrecy is shot through Japanese boat building and many Japanese crafts. And there's even a well-known phrase. If you want to hear some really interesting stories from a craftsperson in Japan, ask them about musumi gekko, which means stolen lessons. And that is a phenomenon very well known that if you're not apprenticing with a family member, you have to steal the essential secrets. Your teacher will not teach you everything. You are labor, free labor. Well, it's expected that your teacher houses and feeds you and maybe gives you a small amount of money. But in that situation, you are also a potential competitor. And so most of my teachers did not apprentice with their fathers. And so they all had stories of stealing their master's secrets. And in this case, my teacher told me that he said he was the best apprentice in the shop, and he also gave his master gifts of alcohol. And eventually the master sort of took him, sort of realized his talents, according to my teacher, and gave him the secrets. In the case of the tugboat, my teacher told me he would sneak into the master's workshop at night with a candle, and there was no electricity. And he would study his teacher's layout. And he figured it out, but he said the other thing I figured out was he was drawing lines that made no sense, specifically to throw me off the track. So in the apprentice system, the apprentice is forced in many, many ways, forced to perform perfect work on command, but also forced ultimately to figure out a way to steal their master's secrets. So this, this is my drawing of the same boat. And here you can see that missing information. Also, I have my drawings in Japanese and English and comprehensive here. These are patterns my teacher made out of scrap wood. That's the angle of the stem and the angle of the transom. This is the angle of the garboard plank at 2 different points. And this particular teacher told me that when I finish building one of these seaweed boats, I burned those 2 patterns. He built 300 of these boats. And he claimed he burned the patterns every single time. So in Urayasu, that community, there were 6 boat building firms. He called them houses. And they were loosely family organizations. And there was intense competition between those. So secrecy was important. Classic Japanese boat building, the boats set up on the floor, there are no work benches, and almost no use of clamps. Everything is held in place with props, a forest of props. And the building itself is an important tool because you need very strong overhead beams to prop against. So here's our seaweed boat almost completed. I'll talk a little bit. These are mortises because that top plank is edge nailed into that bottom plank. And Japanese boats have little to no internal framing. So you're not sending a fastening through the plank into a frame or rib like we do in the West. You're edge nailing the planks to each other, and we'll delineate that, show that in a moment. My Tokyo teacher, this is the other very important technique in Japanese boat building, which is getting a watertight fit between the pieces of wood. There's no caulking used in Japanese boat building. Boats are only caulked when they get old and start to leak, and they're caulked from the inside, not the outside like we do. So my teacher has set up his planking. It's already mortised for those edge nails, and he is running a special set of saws, sawing back and forth through that seam. Each time he completes a pass, he puts the planks a little closer together. And so with each pass of the saw, that fit gets more and more and more precise until it creates a watertight fit. And in the normal sawing motion, it's felt that the scratches that the teeth of the saw leave on the plank edge are channels that will allow water to come from outside the boat to inside the boat. So in the final passes, you have to change the motion of the saw to a rubbing motion so that all those scratches run lengthwise down the plank edge and prevent water from getting through. This technique is called suri awase. Suru is the verb to rub. Awaseru is the verb to assemble. So a clean interpretation would be reconcile. And in fact, I'm told if 2 people are arguing in Japan, they can say, "Oh, well, we made up suri awase. You know, we reconcile." But that rubbing is a good way to understand this method. It's very, very difficult, and my teachers would correct me. They'd take the plank apart, they'd inspect the edges. If it didn't look right, I had to start over. But this is considered one of the central techniques of Japanese boat building. Planks of our little canal car, 3 pieces of wood. So we have done the saw fitting prior to edge nailing these together. We've done the saw fitting, and that full length seam, which is about 18 feet long, for one person that would be half a day's work to get that seam right. And these are the nails, blacksmith made nails. They are flat steel with the head folded to one side. Okay, and you can't use a drill to make you make a round pilot hole for a flat steel nail. So these special chisels are used to make the pilot holes. And the reason they have a hilt, they're called subat nomi, which means hilted chisel. And the reason you have the hilt is you pound them into the wood, and that's the only way you get them out. You pound them back out, and you can see how that hilt has been pounded over. And so mortise half a sloping mortise, half the depth of the plank, half the thickness of the plank. The rectangular hole emerges through the plank edge, and there's a corresponding hole in the plank that it meets. And there's a cutaway of 2 boards. And you see the 2 boards based on the sapwood that's visible. I don't know if you can see it and appreciate it, but that's a very tight fit between those 2 pieces of wood. That is watertight. And so the nail's slightly curved and it's driven in tight there. That's literally an offcut. Our plank was a little bit long and I saw an opportunity and I chopped it off and had 1 nail in the end and I created this cutaway. In Tokyo, I had an interesting moment with my teacher. We were several months into the project. And again, he had said to me, like all my previous 2 teachers, there will be no speaking in the workshop. You are not to talk to me. You may ask me questions at break time and lunchtime, and that is it. And I actually gave up asking questions because I always got the same 2 answers. Mite wakaru or mate wakaru. And those two answers mean watch and you will understand, wait and you will understand. And in fact, those are 2 great answers because that was true in almost every situation. But again, it was really, my teachers were so palpably uncomfortable with the idea of talking and teaching. It was really quite remarkable. But one day my teacher surprised me and he said, I have to show you something. He took a piece of scrap wood and to begin, he got my full attention because he said, if you don't understand this, you can't call yourself a boat builder. So he had my full attention. He sketched out what he was going to do. This is the shape of our bottom, kind of exaggerated, and he needed to check a curvature, a dimension aft where it fits against the flat bottom of the boat. And so he drew his ink line and put a straight line there. Then he took his square and he drew these lines, and then he drew that triangle, and then he took those 2 dimensions, working in silence the whole time. And when he was done, he looked up at me and he said, "Did you understand that?" And I said, "No." And he shook his head, and you can see where he took his hand plane and he planed off the lines. And he drew it a second time. And when he was done, he looked at me and he said, do you understand that now? And I said, "No." And he looked at me and he said, "Go back to work." And he never mentioned it again. And I took that piece of wood at break time and I ran down the Tokyo streets to the first convenience store and I laid it on the copy machine and I made myself half a dozen copies and I brought it back. And I would get those Xeroxes out every couple of months and look at them and look at them and look at them and down the line. And I'd say about 6 months later, I figured it out. But the point is, he felt no responsibility to me to make sure I understood it. And this is sort of the central pedagogy in the Japanese apprenticeship is all the pressure is brought to bear on the apprentice. The apprentice bears 100% of the responsibility for learning. And what I like to say is it's a values-based education. And so what's taught in that first 2 years is powers of observation, perseverance, patience, obedience. The first one's humility. And it's believed in Japan that it is only when the apprentice fully has those values that they can even learn anything. And so we could argue about that, but that's the way it is. This is our Tokyo boat on launch day. If you go to Tokyo, the American foundation that sponsored, that funded this research, we donated this boat to a nonprofit that teaches people how to use the Japanese sculling oar. And if you go to Tokyo, you can row this boat. And by the way, if you are at all interested, there are a number of videos and things I can send you after this talk. If you send me your email address and on the chat, if you leave your email address, I can send some of these resources to you, like how to go do this. I have articles about this and so on. Happy to share that. So up north, I apprenticed in Aomori, which is the north end of the main island of Japan. This was my teacher. He used no drawings whatsoever, just a handful of patterns that only he knew where they went on the boat. And here he is, the saw fitting. We have the backbone of the boat in place. There's the transom, stem is on, and we've propped the two garboard planks, and he's running the saw the length of the boat to get that fit before we nail those on. This is that boat, extremely beautiful boat. It did have frames inside, a bit unusual. As you go farther north, that appears in boat building. But one of the things I'll draw your attention to is the amazing carving that went on the side of the boat. And when I looked at my teacher said that I could not do the carving. He made me paint the carving, but he said only he could carve the motifs. And he called them his signature. And there was carvings at the bow too that you can't see in this photograph. But it was interesting. I looked back at my notes at the end of this project, and it turns out that 1/6 of the total labor in this boat was decorative, which I thought was extraordinary. It's a fishing boat. And I asked him that, and he didn't hesitate. He looked at me and he said, no fisherman would go to sea from this village without those motifs on his boat. Those are what protect the fisherman when he's in the ocean. And it's fascinating. And Molly here has lived in rural Japan, and she might back me up on this, but it's extraordinary to be in rural Japan, which is my favorite part of Japan, where despite the ubiquity of cell phones and high-tech everything that we're used to and the Japanese are famous for, there are still just these, amazing kernels of traditional knowledge and culture and tradition that live on in dances and songs and things like this. And in fact, the modern steel squid boats that fill this village's harbor today all have that motif painted on either side of the pilot house. So no longer a carving, but the images are there. And they are an odd mix of Shintoism and Buddhism. It's a really interesting subject, and for an anthropologist of religion, it would be an interesting story to follow. Now, this is down in Okinawa, and Okinawa is the home of the only revival of wooden boat building today in Japan. Hopefully, it'll expand elsewhere. But like Europe, Oceania, North America, how did traditional boats get preserved? How did an interest in reviving them get sparked? Turn them into a sport. And what happened in the early 1990s were mostly young people, surfers, yachtsmen, windsurfers, and the like, rediscovered the traditional Okinawan fishing boat and found out that they are extraordinarily challenging to sail, and they're very fast. And so they began to find boats, collect old boats, and start racing them. And this has truly created a revival. It spawned a number of new boat builders, including Japan's only woman professional boat builder that I know of. And so in 2010, this had been, the Sabani racing had started, it had been going for about 15 years. There were only 3 elderly boat builders left in the whole archipelago. And I apprenticed with one, and this Japanese woman apprenticed with another. And since then, several young men, I don't know of any other women doing it, but several young men have apprenticed as well. So my teacher had not built a Sabani since the 1960s, because he switched, like the other boat builders, he switched to fiberglass, because that's what the fishermen, that's all switched over. That's what they demanded. And he told me, he said, when 30 years later, these young people came to him and said, we want to commission a Sabani, his first thought was, do I still remember all the dimensions? And there's 4 sheets of plywood here. And he said, I built 4 sizes of Sabani. And I got out these 4 sheets of plywood, and I wrote down all the dimensions. And it's the first example that I'd seen of a boat builder in Japan actually documenting themselves. And so I ran to the copy store with his drawings and took all these dimensions. So Sabani are very interesting. They're what's called a semi-dugout. So they were, before World War II, they were true dugouts. They were made out of a single cedar log, which was always sourced from Miyazaki Prefecture in Kyushu, because there's no cedar growing on Okinawa. So after World War II, as large logs were impossible to get, the boat builders adapted and they began, well, you'll see, they began to use large timbers kind of fastened together and then carved to their final shape. So we began with the side planks. This is a bit out of sequence. I'm going to back up a bit. You're looking at the two side planks laid flat. And what you're seeing there is those planks, which are 2 inches thick, have been half hollowed out. I don't know of any other boat building tradition that does this, but here they're full thickness at what will be the gunnel, the top edge of the boat. Then they're carved to half their thickness down to these ridges, which are intended to support the floorboards eventually. That's full thickness. Then carved halfway down again, and then quickly up to full thickness where they're going to meet the bottom. A tremendous amount of work. Yeah, and my teacher told me he built from the end of World War II to about 1965, he built 100 of these Sabani with no power tools. He didn't get electric power till 1965. So once the sides are done, and that previous photo showed we're bending them, slowly bending them, and in fact, we spent 3 days bending them. I got soaking wet. There was a diesel boiler, and I sprayed hot water while my teacher slowly tightened these temporary turnbuckles and bent the sides to shape. Then we dropped this enormous timber, and we would put 2 wing pieces to finish that timber, this 6-inch thick timber, and started to fit it to the bottom. Meanwhile, we were also carving it to shape. So on the far left, you see that bottom being hollowed out to shape, and we use the overhead chain fall and bring it to the boat upside down and fit it and so on until we get ready to fasten it. Now, one of the reasons I badly wanted to study Okinawan boat building is there are no metal fastenings in the hulls of these boats. They are held together entirely with these hardwood dovetail keys. And some riverboat builders in the main islands of Japan also do that, use these dovetail keys. But the Okinawans are by far the most famous for it because the entire boat is fastened with them. So a quick lesson in how you do this. You see the seam here running across the middle of the photograph. And if you look closely, I haven't finished carving this top and bottom, but I've carved from the pencil line at the 4 corners, but I've carved just inside the pencil line in the middle. Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. So now you got to think here. This is soft Japanese cedar. When the hardwood key is driven in, that extra material acts like 4 wedges and actually pulls those 2 planks together. Or tightens the connection up. And that's the genius of this system. And that's what it looks like. It's quite dramatic. Yeah. And at this point, we have fully shaped the hull. Now, then we rolled the hull over and we installed the dovetail keys all the way around that seam on the inside. Those keys, by the way, are 1 shaku apart. And on the inside of the boat, they alternate in the middle. They're staggered perfectly with the ones on the outside. So if, in effect, inside and out, there's a fastening half a shaku apart. Okay. And you also see that beautiful sculptural hollowed shape of the inside of the boat. This is just some of the most extraordinary boat building I've ever seen. Just the whole carving nature. And interestingly, the Japanese woman, the reason she got transfixed by Sabani was she had just graduated with a master's degree in sculpture.
Oh my God.
Came to Okinawa, took one look at the boats and said, I found myself. So, and she's still building boats. So here at the bow, I love the double dovetail key, and then those cedar spikes get cut off, obviously, and plain flush. In Okinawa, this is our launching ceremony. Native Okinawans do not practice Buddhism or Shintoism, which are the two great religions that coexist in the rest of Japan. They have a matriarchal, wait, is that the right word? All the priests in the Okinawan religion are women. Matriarchal.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think in my last lecture I said matrilineal. That's not right. So this was a shaman. In English, they're called shamans. She was 94 years old. She lived on the island, and she had not yet gotten to the highest level. She was at the second highest level, but it's who we had. So she did it, but I was really quite interested because these are all Shinto motifs: the sake, the mochi, the salt, the rice. So, but she insisted, no, there's nothing Shinto about this. So this is Okinawan religion, and that's my teacher. But that's our launch ceremony. And this is one of the Sabani races. So there are now over 35 teams. And if you look closely, there are both old boats, restored boats, and brand new boats. So it's an amazing revival, an amazing thing to see. So in 2017, I apprenticed with the last builder of these boats. This is another iconic boat. There's a cormorant fishing boat from Gifu. And you may be aware of the Japanese who fish with birds. They let their cormorants out on leashes, dive in the water, grab the fish, they pull them back in the boat, and the leash prevents the bird from swallowing the biggest fish. They can swallow the little ones, but not the big ones. Fish are squeezed out of their gullets into the boat, and the birds are thrown back in. Gifu, about a dozen places in Japan still practice cormorant fishing. Gifu is by far the most famous. And in every place in Japan, it is done now for tourists. Okay. And in Gifu, 100,000 tourists a year board spectator boats and follow 6 hereditary cormorant fishermen, and they are all men. One of them is 18th generation. The most senior cormorant fisherman in Gifu is the 18th generation of his family. And the birds, they fish at night, and the fire basket attracts the fish, which is the ayu, which is a little sweet fish in English, delicious. And the Japanese are mad for it. I mean, they just set up seasonally. It reminds me, I grew up in Connecticut, it reminds me of shad and the shad bakes and that whole tradition. It's the same thing. So you see there's some birds on the gunnel and the bird in the water. That strange costume, that's a grass skirt and a very strange hat. The fishermen in Gifu are absolutely slavish about tradition. You can go find a 600-year-old painting of this, and they are wearing exactly the same outfit. It looks no different. The boats are almost identical. This has been done in Japan for 1300 years, and goes even further back because it was invented in China. And little known fact, Marco Polo brought this idea back to Venice, and briefly they fished with cormorants in Venice, but it didn't stick. So I'm going to show you a short video. This is my teacher. He was the last builder in Gifu of these boats. He had a very interesting technique for driving a nail. You'll be hearing the sound, I believe, off my laptop, which is turned up full volume. But one thing I want you to watch is right before he puts the nail in the hole, he licks it. He passes it through his mouth. And he made me do that to every nail. They were all rusty. And there were almost 1,000 nails in this boat. But I want you to just listen very carefully here. A little bit of backstory. So he plays a rhythm.
Yeah.
And about a third of Japanese boat builders do this. And the other 2/3 think it's complete bunk. Really disparaging. My teachers, I had several of my teachers that most of my teachers did not, and they disparaged it. All my teachers who did it told me one thing right for the very first nail: you cannot copy my rhythm. They all said my rhythm is my signature. My teacher in Urayasu was a maestro at this. And I really need to dig up some of very old video going back to that, because honestly, you could have booked him at Carnegie Hall. He really made music driving a nail. And in fact, his wife told me, she took me aside one day and she said, you know, when husband was nailing a boat, the neighbors would come and gather to listen. Yeah, it was amazing. If you leave me your email address, I've got some other videos of boat builders doing this in different styles that I'm very happy to share with you. But I asked Nasu-san, I mean, obviously when I first met him, recognizing he was the last builder of this incredibly iconic boat, no drawings, it's all memorized. I had to document his work. No one had documented his work. And for 15 years, he said no. And then he said yes. And when he said yes, he said to me, you can see how tired he is. He was just doing that nail for my benefit. He said to me, I can't do any of the physical work. I can only lay down the lines and the dimensions, and you have to do all the physical work. Are you good with that? To which I said yes. But anyway, he's the subject of my most recent book, How to Build These Boats. But it's really a crisis now because they haven't yet been able to find a successor locally, and so I don't know what's going to happen here. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we'd want to hear it again, but we have to move on. There. So, like a lot of riverboat builders, for some reason, they will use stones in addition to the props to hold the boat in place. All the planking is planed on the inside. A lot of these staples, they're laying around, but we use these for clamps all over the boat. And that's our finished boat. And that's 42 feet long. And I planed that inside and out by hand. He insisted it all be hand planed. And you should be able to make out, those are all the plugs where the nails are. I think it was 963 nails. And yes, I had to lick every single one. And it doesn't hurt you, I'm here. But the remarkable thing about this boat, 42 feet long, the planking is about 1 inch thick, which is absurd. And what's even more absurd is that is the only framing in the entire boat, that one beam. And this contributes to the crisis. These boats fall apart in about 10 years, which doesn't surprise me in the least, because they're so flexible. And so they start to leak in the bottom because the seams open up and so on and so forth. And I asked Nasu-san several times, why didn't you at least build the bottom thicker? And he always said the same thing: the fishermen demand the lightest boat possible, because it's somewhat a whitewater river, and they sometimes have to pull the boats over shallows. And then I said, but how about more framing to keep it stiff so that the bottom doesn't open up and leak? And he said, no, they're working with 6 birds. They need as much open space as they can get. And so anyway, it's very interesting how, you know, what's going on here is that the customer is making demands and the boat builder is meeting those demands. And yet it's right today in our modern world, it's creating a tremendous strain on the whole situation. Nasu waited most of his life to build these. The boat that he and I built together, I believe was his 10th cormorant fishing boat. He built 600 boats in his working career, all smaller fishing boats. But the builder of the cormorant boats was always the most senior boat builder of the region. And so Nasu waited until he was in his 70s before that man passed away or retired, and then he stepped in to fill the breach. And now there's nobody to fill that breach. So launch day in Gifu, the tradition on the Nagara River is that a boat is capsized 3 times upon launching. And 3 is a very lucky number in Japan, and it is believed that a boat capsized at launch will never capsize again. So the owner, my Japanese volunteer, myself, and my American volunteer, and we're just about to pull it over the first roll. We're winding down now, I promise. You know, the 6-year apprenticeship was arduous. It definitely weeded people out. If you weren't extremely willing and extremely motivated, if you weren't willing to knock on that door for 15 years, perhaps, you didn't make it. But those craftspeople that came through that tradition emerged with an unbelievable level of skill. And I like this picture. This man spent his life building 20-foot fishing boats. That's all he ever built. And in retirement, built this bentwood vase and this inlaid wooden valise. And he's built these.
Oh my God.
He told me he's Japan's only traditional shipwright. He was the lead shipwright on 4 of these projects. And he told me, this is the culmination, and this is how he put it, this is the culmination of my experience. And he said, having built fishing boats for 50 years, and he was studying the old ships. He was studying old photographs and paintings and documents as much as he could. But he said, the one thing I knew above all else was I knew how those shipwrights thought. He felt himself linked to them. And he said, yeah, I can do this. So he gathered a crew of about 12 other boat builders. That's their 3rd ship. They built that for the port of Osaka. And here's a historic photo. These ships, by the way, operated, you may know that Japan went through a period of 250 years of complete isolation, where it was illegal to leave Japan, and if you came back, you would be executed for having left. And these were the ships of these ships were frozen in time for 250 years. They were built up until about 1900, if you can believe that. So from the 1600s to the late 1800s, and they were coastal ships. All they did was carry cargo around the coast. This is a really interesting photograph because there is, in contrast to this, single mast stepped nearly amidships with a tall rectangular sail. Interesting, those loosely laced vertical panels. This is after meeting foreigners. There's a mizzen mast and there's a foremast. So there were hybrid versions of these vessels at the very, very end. I got to stay in the shipyard right before the launching of his final ship. This is 2006. And this is Michinoku Maru. She is 100 feet long, 100 tons. And this is my favorite statistic. She was built by 11 craftspeople in 15 months average age 69. So, and she's the only one that operated, though that Osaka vessel, there is a move afoot. Osaka's going to host an expo in 2025, and there's a move afoot to relaunch that Osaka ship and get her operating again. My most recent apprenticeship was in Niigata, Japan, building a riverboat with this man. He's the last surviving builder of the riverboats of this region. This is a 21-foot boat. This is a boat I teach. I developed a college class on Japanese apprentice pedagogy that I've now taught 8 times around the country. And I also teach this in a week-long workshop that I've taught for maritime museums and maritime festivals. And my next workshop is the first week of October in St. Michael's, Maryland, at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. So it was a great honor and opportunity to actually go see how the last builder of these boats put these together. Because I was putting them together with my students from my own experience, but I learned some really interesting techniques from him. This is in my workshop just this past February in Hobart, Australia, Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, where I taught 2 workshops, one in Hobart and one in Sydney. So my students, she is piloting a nail hole with the sword hilt chisel. What were they doing? They're carving mortises in preparation for that edge nailing and planing. So you see the dovetail keys. These boats, the bottom is fastened with a combination of nails and dovetail keys, which is what you see some riverboat builders doing. Again, working on the floor, pretty alien. He's a smart man. He's got his knee pads on. Pretty alien to Western woodworkers who used to a bench. And then we got some stones. I love that. And we're getting ready to put one of the side planks on and then saw fitting. So the side planks are propped in place. Actually, we're cheating. We're using a clamp. And then we run the boat building saws back and forth down that seam before we nail it together. That's my last slide. This is my book, my big book on my first 5 apprenticeships and a chapter on that shipwright that you just saw. And then this is just published, my book, my how-to book, specifically on how to build the cormorant fishing boat. So that wraps it up. I look forward to any questions from the internet, the World Wide Web, as well as, but I'll give preference to the folks who.
I don't have any questions.
Okay,
yet,
great.
so
Then please, somebody ask a question. My card is here. Feel free to take it. And yeah, we should get a piece of scrap paper and a pen going around the room. I have some scrap paper. Sorry to go off camera. I stole the scrap paper from the previous talk. So yeah, we can somehow here. People can come up maybe after the talk and give me your email address. Yes.
Did they ever tell you why they lift the nails?
Yes. I asked Nasu-san that. By the way, we pre-rusted them. This was interesting. So the blacksmith, he had never made boat nails before. That's another crisis. The crafts that supply your craft, but he made great nails, and we immediately threw them in brine. Because this is smart, and other boat builders do this, it creates a nail with greater holding power because it's rough. Yeah, it's a brilliant thing. You don't do that with a saltwater boat. You do that with a freshwater boat. And so anyway, so I asked Nasu, because I was terrified of the idea of licking all these disgusting rusted nails, and he didn't say a word. He had made a hole, and he licked the nail, and he put it in the hole, and he pulled it back out, and there was all this sawdust stuck to it. And he said, "That's why." So you can draw whatever conclusion you wish to draw from that. I was a good enough apprentice not to ask for any further clarification, because I know what he would have said, you know. But I mean, I think he thought it was like I don't know, like a adhesive sort of, but had to do it. And by the way, the reason for the rhythmic nailing is edge nailing is inherently risky. You could split the planks. And so the people who play the rhythm say you don't drive a nail fast. You do just the opposite. You have to drive a nail with control very slowly. So there's the hard hit, soft, 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 hard, soft, soft, hard, and that's how you do it. I'm convinced from watching Japanese boat builders that they do it because it's fun. Or that's another reason, because they enjoy it. And I've even seen teams of boat builders, like tap dancers, compete, right? I've seen boat builders do that too. One plays a rhythm while the other listens, and the other tries to upstage that rhythm. Yeah. Yes.
Other than your college roommate who introduced you to the tugboat, what was your background? Did you like carpentry? Like, what drew you then to kind of pursue this?
I guess your laptop can hear the questions. So I went to Japan. I had just finished 5 years working in the small boat shop of the National Maritime Museum in San Francisco. So I was well versed in curating the small boat collection, building replica boats. And, you know, I was young, I was in my late 20s, and I really felt like I found what I wanted to do. I wanted to build boats, but I loved the museum. I loved the museum environment for the intellectual side of it, research, oral interviews, drawings, you know, that kind of thing, lines taking. So I was pretty well primed. And when I went to Japan, the shock for me was there are all these boat builders, and there's no documentation. I have a bookshelf at home full of books that will tell you how to build Western boats. And well, my book, I can say, is the only survey of traditional Japanese boats published in any language. And I can only think of maybe 3 other Japanese titles that I think, you know, approach what I'm trying to do. And there are no researchers doing what I'm doing. Absolutely, there are no researchers working alongside craftspeople to document what they do, which is the only way to get it. And that with the tugboat builder, I made 2 trips with an interpreter and tried to interview him. And what I discovered was he had no language to talk about how he did what he did. He kept saying to us, we were in his parlor, and he kept jumping up and saying, well, I'll show you. And we'd have to run out to the workshop. And it was on that 3rd visit, I just realized we're getting nowhere. He can't do this. And this is getting me nowhere. And I realized I have to become his apprentice. And I tell this story in the introduction to my book. I asked my interpreter, because she was Japanese and I trusted her. I said, I want to ask Mr. Fuji if I can be his apprentice. And she said, absolutely not. You don't speak Japanese. You're a foreigner. This is crazy. You know, this is unthinkable. And the next day he asked me to be his apprentice. So we were on the same wavelength. And the irony is, I didn't speak Japanese. Didn't have to. No, I mean, that's literally true. You could successfully apprentice in a wide range of crafts in Japan with the barest knowledge of Japanese, because no one is going to tell you anything. You just have to pick it up. Yeah. I had a paper maker on the spot ask me if my wife would become his apprentice, because she loves Japanese paper. And he saw me interpreting for her. And he just looked at me, took me aside and said, your wife likes this. And I said, yeah, tell her she can start Monday. Because he had no apprentices. And he was 85, and it had been in the family for 5 generations. And, you know, yeah, no, it's very sad at one level, what's about to be lost. But sorry for the long-winded response, but that's what really grabbed me, you know. So,
So was there a turning point when you felt you understood the Japanese mind?
I will say, I wouldn't, I'm not fluent in Japanese. I'm fluent if we're talking about boat building. And my regular Japanese is probably intermediate. So I'm not going to presume to quote, know the Japanese mind. So, but this is what I'll say. I do know how to be an apprentice. And that says a lot. And there is a way, and I've witnessed it. I've witnessed it with volunteers who come with me who don't know how to behave. And you have to, I like to say that the very first lesson of the Japanese apprenticeship is humility. And this is what our education system absolutely refuses to teach. But all of my teachers, in one way or another, said to me right off the bat, you don't know a thing. And if I tried to say, well, these are all my Western boats, they don't mean anything. Well, these are all my Japanese boats, they don't mean anything either. And I've come, and I try to bring this out in my college course, the notion that what is the truest stance to learn? And I'm a strong believer that stance is, I know nothing. And if you can get to that place, I think you're now ready to really receive. I teach boat building. I've been teaching boat building workshops for over 30 years. And it really chagrins me to see how I have to fight with my students' egos. The student who comes into my workshop and says, yeah, I know how to do that. And the time and energy and effort and learning that's wasted while I battle those egos. And it is amazing to be in Japan, where Japanese people really understand that they need to come in with that mindset of complete humility. So that's something I think I've caught on to. Yes.
I have two questions. First of all, I saw there was the one fort that was supporting the boat because of the cormorants.
Yeah, the beam.
Cormorants.
Yeah, that's
So
just a
one
beam. Yeah.
Fort or whatever you
Yeah.
call it. And so when they build those boats, nobody said to them, can we add another couple of forts, or there's no resistance. It's that method, period.
So in that case, it's the interaction with the customer.
Okay.
And the cormorant fishermen are saying, I mean, they would love a complete open boat, which would be absurd, because they have to go back and forth, and now they have to hurl that one beam when they're fishing. They don't like doing that. So the one beam, that's it. That's the concession to the structure of the boat.
So to have these boats, survive longer,
Yeah.
do they use West system? Is there anybody updating them to do any of that? And then, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing that's done is as the bottoms start to leak first, and most 5 of the 6 cormorant fishermen will put a layer of fiberglass on the bottom to try to keep things together. It adds a lot of weight, which is a disadvantage. The 18th generation fisherman refuses to put fiberglass on his boat. I see that I remember. And his bottom of his boat leaks pretty badly.
And you reside in Vermont.
Yeah.
I mean, you've spent so much time in Japan. Do you miss Japan right now? Do you plan to go back soon?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of a large contract. I'm building 6 33-foot traditional wooden tour boats for a downriver passenger tour company. They lost their fleet of boats in this major flooding in 2020. And I was in Japan last fall. I started the project. I was just in Japan this spring, continuing that contract. And then I go back to Japan in October to finish that contract.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Your wife misses it also, I assume.
Yeah, she loves Japan. Yeah, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you price the cost of building one of these boats?
So the boats you saw, all the boats you saw tonight That's research. And those projects happen because I raised the research funding, because two of the boat builders you saw today had not built a boat in over 20 years. And my research grant, we essentially commissioned a boat so that brought them out of retirement so I could work with them and document their techniques. So these are not commercial projects. Now, my current project, yes, how do I price it? You know, I look at my hours and my stress and all my costs, and I come up with, you know, I throw out a price. So these are all, this is all research, you know, yeah. I built 4 boats for Japanese gardens, 1 in Japan and 3 in the United States. So those were commercial projects that of Japanese boats I've built in North America, 3 boats. So you want one?
If he wins the lottery this week.
Oh, well, that's it. Take a card. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just curious about the paper making. Has your wife continued with that?
My wife loves pottery.
Yeah.
And paper making. To pursue that on her own, that you need a lot of equipment and stuff. But when we're in Japan, we have it's not a fight because of my wife, I have seen some of the most amazing places and craftspeople and things. But we are literally bouncing from the coast, which is where I want to be, looking for boat builders and boats, to the mountains, where she's saying there's a pottery town, there's a paper making town. And so that's what we do. We zigzag around Japan. And so when we're in Japan, you know, if there's a famous paper making town and we're near it, we're going to go there. And yeah, and I've seen some great pottery and paper thanks to her, which I never would have seen otherwise.
And she's willing to share?
She's willing to share. Yeah, she's willing to share. I mean, I'd love to set her up in a pottery apprenticeship, but that's brutal too. Yes.
Just a question about the pottery apprentice. We have a friend of ours who, he was German, his mother was a famous German potter. He lived in Japan for 10 years and apprenticed and did pottery there.
Oh my
We've
God.
never talked to him about his apprenticeship.
Oh, you got to ask.
Yeah.
Please do.
We're going to talk about.
Please do. There's a very famous, he's retired now, exquisite potter named Malcolm Wright, who went to Alfred University and got a master's in ceramics, which is one of the most famous programs in North America, and then got a Fulbright and did a 6-year apprenticeship with a National Living Treasure potter in Karatsu. And he told, I was on a panel discussion with him there at the University of Vermont, had me, the 3 craftspeople that had been trained in Japan, a metal worker, a potter, and the boat builder. And Malcolm told the story of, he came into his apprenticeship, his master handed him a cup, said, make 500 of these. So Malcolm went back and threw 500 cups. He said they put them on sheets of plywood and carried them into his master, put the 500 cups, they hadn't fired them, of course. And the teacher, without saying a word, took his finger and broke all 500 cups. When he was done, he said, the rims are no good. Make 500 cups. So Malcolm went back and made another 500 cups and brought them in, and his teacher, again, destroyed every cup and said, the rims are good, but the bases are bad. Make 500 cups. So he went back and made 500 more cups. So we're up to 1,500 cups. And the teacher, what do you think? He destroyed all the cups and he said, the rims are good, the bases are good, but they don't work together. Make 500 cups.
Oh my God.
So Malcolm made cup 1,501 to 2,000, came back, laid them out, and the teacher said, we'll fire these. Okay, so you ask yourself, you know, you can have a variety of reactions to this. Is this abuse? Is this a lot of things? You know, and it could, depending on the personality, it could be any of those things. Malcolm does not feel this. What he says is humility. And he said, there is nothing like advancing your skills at the wheel than throwing 2,000 cups. You know? And my wife actually, one day she was reading about Japanese pottery and she went to her wheel and she spent the whole day And she came out and she was almost in tears. She said, I just did something I've never done before. I said, what's that? She said, I threw pots and every single one of them I destroyed. As soon as I finished it, I looked at it and I mushed it up and I started throwing again. And what she realized was when I try to make the perfect pot with, the first time, I'm sort of destroying myself because I'm disappointed. I'm no good. I'm not, I don't have the talent yet. But to give myself the freedom to just throw it and then throw it away. Let go of it and go back to the next pot. And she said, I learned more this afternoon throwing pots and destroying them than I think I've learned in all the pottery workshops I've ever taken. Yeah. Well, you're a lawyer, go into the office and try this. Anyway. Yes, one last question, I guess we'll wrap up.
Okay, on the paper making,
Okay.
I assume you were talking about artistic paper type, not like mass production.
Washi, which washi is the traditional Japanese paper. It's used for a variety of things. I mean, the finest shoji screens have washi. Washi, actually museum conservators use it to repair works of European painting because it's almost indestructible. Now, washi is just, it's decorative, but it's not a mass-produced item.
So they make it like one sheet at a time?
Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. Email addresses.